thanks everyone for being here on the last day. Yes, so this talk is about bilingualism and the brain and neuroplasticity, how the brain changes because of the experience of bilingualism. The taking stock and moving forward bit is we just review what we know so far. And I'm reviewing what we know so far because up until very recently, it didn't make a lot of sense. But I think now it makes some sense. And now we know how to move forward. I'll start by acknowledging the funding of this work. So some of the earlier parts of this research program were funded by the Economical and Social Research Council in the UK, and some internal funding by the University of Reading, and especially the Center for Integrative Neuroscience and Neurodynamics. But the bulk of this work has been funded by different PhD studentships, supported by the University of Reading, by the Saudi government, and also by the Multimind international training group funded by the European Union back in time when European funding was a thing in the UK. So that's the political statement of the day. Right, okay. I am going forward with this. Yeah, okay. So experience-based structural neuroplasticity, what does that mean? Brain morphology, the structure of a brain, is not static, and we have very good evidence now to show this. So life experiences can cause adaptations of the structure of the brain, both at the macroscopic level, that is gross measures of volume that we can measure in the MRI scanner, for example, and also at the microscopic level, that is the number of synapses that are formed in our brain. And actually, these macroscopic versus microscopic changes are not independent of each other. One creates the other, actually. These changes, experience-based adaptations, apply to the healthy brain, but they also apply to the diseased brain. And to a certain extent, they are independent of developmental trajectories. So we know that the brain changes in shape as we grow and as we age, right? That's very well documented. There's no doubt about this. But we know that these changes that have to do with our experiences go on top of the developmental trajectories. So experience-based neuroplasticity means that cognitively demanding experiences cause gray and white matter adaptations in those brain regions related to the task at hand, to the new skill that you acquired, the new experience that you get immersed in. And we know that from fields like memory training or juggling, or if you're a basketball player, your cerebellum, the posterior part of the brain, gets bigger. So there's a lot of evidence to show this. At the moment, you may be thinking, okay, white matter, gray matter, synapses, what is he on about? So if you've been to a talk of mine in the past, you may recognize what I call my educational / patronizing slide, just to ensure that we're all on the same page when it comes to this sort of terminology. So this is a brain. If you cut the brain in half, you will see that the surface of the brain is much darker than the inside of the brain. And also you have some dark bits buried right deep in the brain. The surface of the brain is what we call the gray matter. The inside is what we call the white matter. Okay? What are these things? So what you see here is a couple of neurons. The neuron is the building block of our nervous system. And each neuron has two main components. The cell body here, which is surrounded by the dendrites, these extensions. So the dendrites receive input from other neurons or from our sensors. This information gets synthesized in the cell body, and then a new piece of information, an electrical signal, is created, which travels down the second part of the neuron, the axon, and then is communicated to other neurons via those connections, the synapses. Okay, so the synapses are the connections between neurons. The cell, the neuron, is surrounded by a membrane, which has an grayish color, which means that the gray matter are all the cell bodies next to each other. The axon, this long extension that provides communication with other neurons, is surrounded by this fatty lipid, which is produced by this sort of cells called oligodendrocytes. So the oligodendrocyte will wrap itself around the axon, and the color of this is off-white. So if you put all the axons together, you have what we call the white matter. Yeah. Why do we need this? Well, the axon is the main avenue that this electrical signal is communicated to other neurons, as we said, right? But it needs some sort of insulation. Otherwise, this information will dissipate in space. Think about it as any cable, right? So you have the metal in it where electricity runs through, and then you have plastic casing that stops this electricity from dissipating in the space and killing me, probably. Well, not this one, but yeah, it's the same. It's exactly the same idea. So we'll come back to these terms, but let's see how structure changes as we learn something, right? We're not on bilingualism yet. So in this very nice graph from Wegner et al., you see the different processes that take place when you get immersed in a new experience or you start learning a new skill. So starting at panel A, these are changes in behavioral performance. So you're getting better in a task. You start with knowing nothing, but then over time you get better, right? That's the easiest one. If you focus on panel B and D, you see what happens under the hood. So the trajectory is this. This goes much slower than expected, but that's fine. So as you learn, there you go. As you learn something, your neurons start growing more of these extensions, more of the dendrites, and more and more and more. Why does that happen? Because they rewire themselves. They create more connections with other neurons in order to find this network that will make this skill possible. So when you learn something, you get all this rewiring. The brain is trying different pathways through which the new task is getting served, let's say. So while this happens, so these are the microstructural changes that I talked about, and this reflects itself in changes in gray matter volume. So practically, the region that's involved in this skill gets bigger because of all this extra rewiring. Okay, happy so far? After a while, when you become an expert, say, in this skill, suddenly you see the gray matter volume starts dropping again. This is because the brain has created all these connections. Only some of them are good ones, and some of them are surplus. So when you reach this point, the brain knows that, okay, I'll keep this one, but then I will kill everything else that I created in the process. And this is an effect that we call pruning. So gray matter starts from a baseline. When you start learning something, it grows as you learn it. And when you become an expert, it starts dropping again. And the brain does that because all these extra connections consume energy, and the brain doesn't like that. Okay, so it only keeps the good ones. This is related to the activity of other types of cells called the microglia and astrocytes that we haven't covered yet, but will become relevant later on. So this is how we see changes in the gray matter as an effect of acquiring a new skill. When it comes to white matter, which is the axons really, and practically white matter is the changes happen to this layer that wraps itself around the axons. We get white matter increases, which are interpreted as increased availability of myelin, this lipid, this fatty lipid. And we know that the more the myelin in the white matter, the better the relay of information. So that's how it works. If you have very good insulation, then you have very good communication between brain areas. So myelin can be enhanced as a result of training. And we also know that it's particularly vulnerable to aging and also neurodegeneration, multiple sclerosis. Hold that thought, we'll come back to that. So this is the trajectory of this effect. So you have an oligodendrocyte here, this sort of cell, wrapping itself around different axons around it, right? So in this graph, red axons are the active ones, blue axons are the inactive ones. So we get an active axon, you get the oligodendrocyte wrapping itself around it to promote this communication of information. And with days and training and then weeks of training, then you get different effects. So if both axons remain active, you have more and more and more of this wrapping around. Yeah, so you get more myelin in these axons. But if one of those axons becomes inactive for some reason, then you start losing this insulation, right? So it becomes smaller, as you can see. This one is super active, so you have even more myelin. So at the macroscopic level, you could say that active axons have more myelin. It increases all the time. Yeah. So we've talked about changes in gray matter and changes in white matter. Hopefully it will move. Yeah, okay. Let's remember why we're here after this crash course on neuroplasticity. So is bilingualism a skill or an experience? You could argue it is. It can be viewed as a long-term experience, which encompasses ongoing demands, both in learning the additional language, but most importantly, in controlling between languages, right? We all agree that all the languages that we speak are active, and we need to control which one we produce each time. And we also know that bilinguals become better in this task, especially bilinguals that find themselves in immersive bilingual environments. So those that are actively using their second language or actively switching between their languages. If that's the case, and you have this challenging skill to master, does it mean that this skill also affects brain function and brain structure? And if that's the case, how does this happen? And where in the brain does this happen? And we will focus on structuring this talk. But I'll start by bringing back the adaptive control hypothesis, which you're all familiar with, and the neuroimaging version of this paper, the one that came out 2019, where Abutalebi and Green identified several key regions that are involved in language processing and control, which adapt their function in bilinguals. And these include several regions in the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, right in the middle of the brain, the thalamus and the basal ganglia. So these are the gray matter modules that I said are buried inside the brain. Parietal regions, the side of the brain, and the cerebellum. I won't go into details about the ACH, you're probably familiar with it, but the gist is that these adaptations relate to linguistic contexts, right? So they're not the same for everybody. And the linguistic context includes the intensity of the bilingual experience, in the sense that the more immersed you are, the more likely it is you find these adaptations. And this draws back to ideas by other people, including Pingley and other colleagues, even before that paper. Fine, okay, we know these things about function. Structure. Experience-based functional adaptations could be accompanied by structural adaptations. And we've mentioned that already, right? So you learn how to juggle, you learn how to play basketball, whatever. You find structural adaptations in the brain. Some people started looking at this possibility earlier in the process. And indeed, several studies showed adaptations in gray matter regions that were actually identified by the adaptive control hypothesis. So we have adaptations to the left inferior parietal lobule reported, a region which is crucial for vocabulary acquisition in your second language. The left inferior for the gyrus, the anterior temporal lobe, the cerebellum. Well, they do a million of things, but most notably, they do grammatical processing. The middle from the gyrus, the anterior cingulate cortex, which are good places for cognitive control, but also adaptations in the white matter tracts that connect these regions. I've only included the acronyms here for a very good reason, because this thing stands for inferior frontal occipitotemporal fasciculus, and then the superior longitudinal fasciculus, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not going to torture you with the full names. Just stick with the acronyms now, right? So why do we get changes in white matter tracts? Well, increased language selection and monitoring needs, as you become an expert in bilingualism, require better connectivity between brain regions. So you get the gray matter changing as you learn, increasing and then decreasing as you learn how to juggle between the two languages, but you also get the white matter getting better in relaying information by increasing itself in volume as well. However, and this is a moment in your career where you start back and say, why am I doing that to myself? There has been huge variability in the results, both in terms of location and in terms of direction. What do I mean by location? So different studies have reported changes in frontal regions, in parietal regions, in temporal regions, in the hippocampus inside the brain, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, cerebellum, cingulate cortex, pretty much the entire left hemisphere. but these are different effects in different studies. Okay. Also, similar pattern was observed when it comes to effects in the white matter tracts, which I haven't put in this graph because it would become really, really complicated. And it's not only the variability in terms of location, it's also the variability in terms of the direction of these effects. The majority of the studies show increases in bilinguals compared to monolinguals. Some studies show decreases. And this is where my favorite group comes in, interpreters. So all the studies on interpreters did not make any sense if they were viewed next to the regular bilinguals, right? So the most scientific way of describing this, it's an absolute mess. So, well, if you look into the mess, you might be able to identify interesting patterns, actually. So in a study that we published in 2017, we found expansions in the basal ganglia, these subcortical structures, and the thalamus, in immersed sequential bilinguals versus monolinguals, right? So these are the structures that were affected. So I've delineated the structures, and also the yellow bits that you cannot see are the parts of the expansion. So all these structures are involved in language and articulatory control. And also we found that one of the structures, the globus pallidus, was predicted, the expansion of this was predicted by the amount of immersion. So the more immersed you were, the longer you were immersed in a L2-speak environment, the bigger it became. Interestingly, these findings were comparable to earlier findings in a study with simultaneous bilinguals. So I didn't mention it. In our study, our participants were all late bilinguals that came to the UK at the age of, don't know, 20 or something, but they had lived in the UK for about 13 years. So they were immersed in an environment where they had to use their second language. And we find similar patterns in Catalan Spanish bilinguals in Barcelona, right? What do these groups have in common? Well, if you just look at it, not much. But they may do have some things in common, which we'll see in a second. In the same study, we also tested sequential bilinguals of comparable proficiency to this group, but limited immersion. So people that had just arrived in the UK practically, they only had a few months of stay in the UK. So compared to monolinguals, we only found reshaping of the coded nucleus. So none of these structures was affected, and we had effects in a different structure, the coded nucleus. So this tells us that proficiency has nothing to do with this, because they were equally proficient. This tells us that the age of acquisition has nothing to do with this, because you have late and early showing similar effects. The only real difference is that these people were immersed in a bilingual environment. Let's move on. Interesting pattern 2. In one of the first studies to show effects of white matter in the brain by my colleague and friend Gigi Luke, they reported increased white matter integrity in older bilinguals compared to monolinguals in all these white matter tracts of exotic names that we know provide connectivity between different brain areas. Thus, these were people in the 60s, I believe, based in Montreal in a bilingual environment, right? So lifelong bilinguals practically. In a different study, 2015, we brought in young bilinguals in the 30s, again immersed in the UK for a few years. And guess what? We reported a pattern which I'm not sure you're able to see, but it's almost identical. Right? So just look at all the bits in yellow and green and red, what I'm talking about, which are the significant results. So both the older bilinguals in Montreal and the younger bilinguals in the UK showed increased white matter integrity, as we call it, compared to monolinguals in the same set of tracts. What did these groups have in common? Active and immersed bilinguals, constant users of their second language, at least, maybe more language, maybe both languages. So this may start making some sense. Here's a summary of what we knew up until then, right? Cortical gray matter increases have been reported in sequential bilinguals and trilinguals without a lot of experience, lifelong simultaneous older bilinguals and adults in L2 training studies. Cortical gray matter reduced in interpreters were compared to multilingual controls, and also in simultaneous bilingual children. Subcortical gray matter, that's the basal ganglia and the thalamus, and also white matter integrity follow very, very similar patterns. So you get increases in subcortical gray matter in simultaneous bilinguals, immersed sequential bilinguals, simultaneous bilingual children, reductions in interpreters, again, my favorite group, and then white matter integrity increases in similar groups, and then some decreases again in interpreters. This is about to blow your mind, so I'll give you a simpler summary. So cortical gray matter increases are usually reported in bilinguals with limited experience in language use or language switching, L2 language use or language switching compared to monolinguals. Subcortical gray matter volume and white matter integrity increases are reported in experienced bilinguals, people that find themselves in immersive environments. When you compare them to monolinguals, but also when you compare them to less experienced bilinguals. Then the decreases, which is the most interesting finding, are usually reporting the very experienced lot, which is the interpreters, compared to the rest. So I saw it as my mission on this planet to try to make some sense out of the chaos. So the challenge is to understand whether those structural adaptations in the bilingual brain fluctuate over time, which factors determine this, and what are the patterns we should expect for different regions of the brain. The way to look at these things is obviously to run longitudinal studies. And if you have tried to apply for funding to run an MRI longitudinal study, you will know how difficult it is to get it, right? So what we did in 2018, to this day, I'm amazed that the university agreed for us to invite back some people from the 2015 study and pay for the scans. I don't know how I managed that. I'm very happy. So we brought back some people after 3 years of the original scan. The only condition was that they were still in the UK. They were still doing what they did at the original scan, and they didn't do any language training or anything in between. So they were getting on with their lives practically, right? No explicit training, nothing. If some of them tell them, oh, started learning Spanish or whatever, we excluded them. So, sorry. You would expect nothing to happen, right? Because they weren't doing anything. Well, actually, we had increases. We reported increases in the gray matter of the cerebellum, contractions in the caudate, and contractions decreased in white matter integrity of the frontal part of the brain within 3 years. So these were people doing nothing by means of language training, but the people that came back with an extra 3 years of immersion in the UK, right? So this tells us that brain structure is dynamic, and even everyday life can change the structure of our brain. Taking all of this together, the previous hazy sort of evidence and some newer evidence that we produced, I came up with a model trying to bring order to the chaos that I was talking about, which I called Understanding Structural Plasticity in the Bilingual Brain, that paper, the Dynamic Restructuring Model. So very briefly, in this paper, I suggest that we should view these effects through a prism of increased experience in being immersed in bilingual environments. And at a first stage, at the initial exposure stage, when you first get this experience of switching between languages or even acquiring the language, you will find changes in cortical gray matter, these parietal and frontal regions that are important for language and grammar acquisition. Some regions that also do language control, like the ACC. And then slowly, you may start getting more effects in subcortical regions and the cerebellum, which are involved in language control and also grammatical acquisition. With increased exposure, you find that the more experienced bilinguals in the literature do not show any effects in the cortex. So this takes us back to the whole theory about neuroplasticity, right? That you get gray matter increasing when you start learning something, but then those increases disappear when you become an expert in doing something. So this seems to hold for the cortex, but not for subcortical structures. So the more experienced bilinguals, which I call this stage consolidation, it's just a label, you only find increases in subcortical structures and the cerebellum. And this is the profile of participants that demonstrates increases in white matter integrity as well. So now it's not necessarily about acquisition, but it's about control and communication between brain regions. The third stage, which is the less well understood simply because we don't have evidence from people tested for a long period of time, is what I call the peak efficiency, when even the subcortical structures start showing decreases in volume, and then you even get some decreases in white matter tract as well, because now you have a very, very optimized system, and all this extra tissue is not needed anymore. Yeah. The other thing to remember is that this can affect different parts of the brain, right, related to acquisition, processing, control, but in different trajectories. So what seems to be the case is that you get these effects first in parietal and frontal regions, which are at this stage when you start to learn language or controlling between languages. So you get all these increases to begin with. With increased experience, you start getting the decreases again. So these regions renormalize, let's say. But then it's the same time when you start the same cycle in those regions of the brain that are involved in language control. So you may have different parts of the brain being at different stages of this process at the same time. So if you consider all these trajectories and go back to the older findings, which seemed messy at the time, I'd like to think that this makes sense, because all these people, all the bilinguals in those studies, were not similar to each other. They were very different groups. So all these studies that showed different effects only captured different windows of this process, right? So the non-immersed bilinguals are not the same as the immersed bilinguals. So if you put them together based on this, I'd like to think it makes more sense. And the idea is that bilingualism is a dynamic experience and should be studied as such. At least when it comes to those studies of differences in brain structure and function, it's not good enough to say we have a bilingual group and a monolingual group, right? I would even expand that to the whole executive functions literature, but let's not do that now. Definitions of bilingualism have been varied and have been agnostic to actual experiences, especially in the earlier studies of this field. And there are all these suggestions now that we should move away from the monolingual control. And the way I like to tackle this is, okay, we include monolinguals in our research, but we also give them the language background questionnaires, because sometimes people say they're monolingual, but then they give you a score of language use, which is very low in the scale. So to me, this is variability that needs to be taken into account. There's a beautiful paper that came out very recently, Titone and Tiv, talking about how we should be looking at the systems framework of bilingualism, which relates to this debate. I will refer you to that one. I won't cover this paper now. So how do you study bilingualism as a dynamic experience when it comes to brain restructuring? The first attempts we did with my former student, Mr. Luca, where we had a group of, how many were they? 70, I think, bilinguals that we threw in the scanner, scanned them for gray and white matter, and then also measured the bilingual experiences with the LSBQ questionnaire. And we got scores for their amount of L2 immersion, age of acquisition, home use of L2, social use of L2, so on and so forth. A bit complicated set of analysis, but what we found is that in this panel, in A, you find significant expansions on the coded nucleus as predicted by L2 social. So the more you use your L2 in social environments, the bigger the coded is, practically. On this panel, you find significant expansions and contractions. Now that's reshaping, actually, of the coded again, and also the putamen in green, the thalamus cyan, as predicted by immersion. So the more immersed you are, the bigger those effects are. We also found some effects for brain function that are predicted by the same variables, both at rest and also during a task. But as I said, I won't talk about function today. That was good at the time. We were very excited. But then we realized that this paper tested for linear effects. My own theory does not predict linear effects, right? Predicts non-linear effects. So that's good enough to begin with, but there's no real reason to expect these effects to be linear. So let's do nonlinear. So that's a subsequent study with another of my former students, Michal Korenar, where we used my new favorite stats approach, GAMS, which can detect nonlinear effects. And we wanted to put the theory to the test directly when it came to the coded. So we tested 114 non-immersed this time, highly proficient Czech English bilinguals, and we measured the bilingual experience. So in this case, we used the LSBQ and specifically the composite score of the LSBQ. If you're not familiar, LSBQ produces all these measures of immersion, social use, home use, but then produce a composite score that encompasses all of them. So we looked at the codet, because the codet is the one structure that is very, very commonly reported in the literature. And it's the one that one of those that got me thinking about, is it for non-immersed ones, immersed ones, so on and so forth, right? So the codet is here in the brain. In this graph, you see something that got me really, really excited. So the x-axis is the LSBQ score, starting from minus for reasons of how it's calculated, doesn't really matter. And in the y-axis, you see the volumes of the codet. This graph tells us that with increased experience, there's an increase in the volume of the codet, and after a certain point, it plateaus and possibly starts dropping again. Does the pattern sound familiar? It's a typical neuroplasticity pattern we've seen in other studies, and it's what I predicted in my model. So I was very, very, very happy. What made me even happier, I was very happy with this paper, I don't know if you noticed, is when we threw age in the equation. So we had a large age range between 20 and 50-ish, right? And we know that the brain ages, and by aging means shrinking, right? So what we have here is a 3D plot. Let me walk you through it. Again, composite score in the x-axis, volumes in the y-axis, right? And this curve here is this curve here, the exact same thing, okay? But now we are the third dimension, which is age, in the z-axis. So towards the back of this box, you have the younger participants at 20. At the front, you have the older participants at 50. So this drop tells you that the older you get, the smaller your codet is. No surprises here, right? That's the definition of aging of the brain. However, what do these points tell us? So here you have 50-year-old bilinguals who are super experienced in using languages, right? So these are the functionally monolingual 50-year-olds, and these are the super experienced bilingual 50-year-olds. Back here, you have the functionally monolingual 20-year-olds. So this is some sort of evidence, I don't have the good stats for it, so don't hold me account to it, that 50-year-old bilinguals preserve the structure of the codet over time, and it's comparable to people that are 30 years younger. Right? That's why I got really excited about this paper. So very briefly, I will mention another study that we did with my collaborator, Lidon Marin, and that was done in Catalonia now. So we tested 274 immersed, highly proficient Catalan-Spanish bilinguals, and we had a different bilingual experience questionnaire there, not the LSBQ. And very briefly, I will just say that we find similar nonlinear effects in frontal regions and also some effects in the putamen, the cerebellum. Actually, we had a whole lot of effects there. There's no time to talk about everything. All I was trying to say with this one is we find effects in non-immersed bilinguals, the Czechs, but also in lifelong simultaneous bilinguals. right? So in all cases, you have measured the bilingual experience and you show that it predicts those patterns in a way. There are other ways of looking at this. Looking at changes in metabolic activity in the brain. So metabolic activity can be measured by looking at certain chemicals, the availability of which changes according to certain events. So we're looking at choline, creatine. I won't bother you with that much, but the changes in the concentrations of these metabolites are usually linked to things like aging, linked to astrocyte activity, cognitive training, microglia activity, and functional and structural brain adaptations, which is what we care about, again linked to microglia activity. So you can measure these concentrations and use them as indices of neuroplasticity, of changes in structure. And that's what we did in 2021. So we focused on this part of the basal ganglia, including the caudate and the putamen. You will hear about the caudate a lot, right? And we measured the concentrations of myo-inositol and N-acetyl aspartate, or INS and AA for you and me. So what you see in these graphs is that, so this is the age of our participants, and this is the concentrations of INS in this case. So you find that for monolinguals, the older you get, the higher the INS concentration is. That's an aging pattern. That was expected, right? For bilinguals, this slope is much steeper because you have the effects of aging, which we cannot escape. I'm sorry to crack the news. But you have the added effects of these pruning processes of bilingualism, which also produce higher concentrations of the same metabolite. How do we know that this extra bit is because of bilingualism? Well, we extracted those concentrations, we ran them into a regression, and we found that the LSBQ composite score predicts them very well. Right? So that's, again, the index of bilingual experience. The same holds for NAA, but it works the other way. So NAA gets lower as you age, but the patterns are exactly the same in reverse. So, familiar face in this slide. We have been talking about how bilingualism should be viewed as a continuous experience. When it comes to cognition in the brain, this punchy versus controversial title was there on purpose. So I would invite you to go back to the special issue that we edited with Mark very recently. There's a lot of interesting papers there, and this special issue has hosted the work of many of you in this audience. And thank you very, very much for contributing. Right. How am I doing for time? Wow. Okay. Yeah. Told you it's going to be long. Right. So you may be wondering, what about brain development? The brain does develop, right? And does change in structure as we develop. So we know that brain development is continuous, non-linear. It varies by gray matter region and it varies by the metric that you look at, let's say volume. We will focus on the cortex, right? The surface of the brain that we know it starts growing in thickness up until the age of 10, and then it starts thinning down again, right? So this is what you see here, a thinning of the cortex as you get from the age of 10 to the age of 30. So the question is, does the bilingual experience interact with these patterns? The literature is tiny. We have less than 10 papers looking at this, mostly the work by Arturo Hernandez, but some other people as well. We tried to do something with that, and we found that bilingualism actually slows down typical cortical thinning in language-related regions. I will draw your attention in the interest of time to this graph, the inferior parietal cortex. The blue line is monolinguals growing from the age of, 3 to 21. So it gets thinner as we develop. Again, developmental pattern, we're happy with that. With bilinguals, it means, it seems like this thinning is delayed for a bit. So it's thicker for longer and they catch up later in life. What does that mean exactly? That's out to discuss, but at least we have evidence that bilingualism does interact with typical development of the brain. Why does all this matter, right? And aging is why this all matters. So we know that brain volumes continue to decline in older age. I mentioned that. This is the definition of aging, right? The brain shrinks. And this is usually commensurate with decline in functional and structural connectivity and decline in behavior. But these processes vary between individuals. And there are two mechanisms that can explain this variability that have been very well described in other fields, not just in our field. So we can experience what we call a brain reserve, which means long-term buildup of neural tissue, which means that when you get older, there's more tissue to lose. Or cognitive reserve, that you may experience preserved cognitive ability in the face of neural loss. In other words, your brain shrinks, it ages, but you keep going for a bit longer. So you're still cognitively intact, let's say. And both processes have been linked to cognitively enhancing, enriching lifestyle factors, most notably education. But some people say that, you play chess, you do gardening, you play an instrument, and that keeps your brain younger. Maybe the case, but all these things are leisure activities, right? Bilingualism is not a leisure activity if you are in an immersive environment. So you have to push yourself in order to perform. Very briefly, Perrin and Abutalebi suggested that lifelong usage of two languages leads to enhancement of cognitive control, which in turn can be attributed to either neurostructural changes in gray and white matter, the neural reserve, as we call it, or the brain reserve, as I mentioned it, the same thing, or neurofunctional changes, so neural compensation. So you may be losing brain tissue, but you use whatever's left of your brain in a more efficient way. So your behavior does not change as quickly as you're expected to change. We dipped our toes into this with another former student, Tom Voits, and we looked at older immersed bilinguals in the UK, compared them to monolinguals. So I still do the comparisons, right? And we found that they had larger hippocampi. So the hippocampus is this structure right in the middle of the brain, which does a million things again, but the most important thing that it does is memory. And we have evidence for a better preserved hippocampus structurally in bilinguals. And if you think that in the context of the whole executive function advantage in older age in bilingualism, this may be related, this effect may be related to this. We also found that the volumes of both the left and the right hippocampus were predicted by the composite score again, right, by a measure of bilingual experience. Moving on, mild cognitive impairment, which is a condition, we don't call it disease, right? It's a condition which is thought to precede full-blown Alzheimer's disease, right? So this is where cognitive decline starts, but it's not as profound yet. So we tested 40 Catalan Spanish patients with mild cognitive impairment. So you may say 40, that's a very small N. If you try to do research in MCI, this is a huge N. And again, we looked at the volumes of the hippocampus. We used another measure of bilingual experience, language entropy. And again, we found that, well, these are the typical aging patterns as well, right? Between the age of 60 and 85, you have a drop in the volume of the hippocampus, as expected. But we also found that language entropy predicts the volumes in the same non-linear way. So as you become an expert, as you become very experienced, it grows, and then it shrinks a bit. So you still get this efficient hippocampus, even if you're an MCI patient. Very new paper. I'm still digesting what this actually means. Thank you, Mark. And the other thing we wanted to look at is whether this effect that has been reported for Alzheimer's disease, we're now reporting for MCI, whether this is a more generalized effect that can be applied in other types of progressive neurodegeneration. Why would that be? Because we know that diseases like Parkinson's and Huntington's target the basal ganglia. But we also know that the basal ganglia gets enhanced by the experience of bilingualism. We've seen that already, the caudate and the putamen, right? So is there interaction? The same goes to multiple sclerosis. We know that it targets white matter, but at the same time, we've seen all these enhancements of white matter by bilingualism. So where is the interaction? So we collected all the information, all the evidence that was there on this review paper. Spoiler alert, we're talking about 3 or 4 papers, right? But it's an interesting, well, it's a bit long, but it's an interesting read if you're interested in this field. Speaking of multiple sclerosis, I did mention there's limited available evidence, and we know from other studies that there is some compensatory plasticity of the right hippocampus and putamen during a language acquisition program. In other words, you get more, you get these structures work more if you're an MS patient when you learn a language. Well, we don't have anything about brain structure yet. We have good reasons to be looking at this. Nobody has yet. You cannot find the patients very easily. But what we did, this is just a behavioral study, which I wanted to report here because we found that bilingual MS patients did not differ from bilingual controls in the monitoring costs they experienced in a Flangers task. So I just want to mention we have some small initial behavioral evidence for what I was going to say, cognitive reserve in patients with MS. If you're interested in this sort of work and similar work, I will refer you to another special issue we edited with Ana Inés Ansaldo and Tom's. That's a second shameless plug of my edited volumes for today. That's the last one. Right, so almost there, Mark. Where to go next? Different flavors of dual or multiple language use may encompass differences, qualitative differences or quantitative differences. And these differences may have different effects on cognition and the brain, right? So if I had all the money in the world, I would like to study multilingualism, diglossia, bidialectalism, bimodal bilingualism, heritage bilingualism, blah, blah, blah. Where do you stop? Right? We've done some work on multilingualism, where the additional language learning comes with additional demands for cognitive control. There is some evidence. I'll just skip other people's work so I can focus on my work. So with another former student of mine, Jian Yi, we looked at subcortical restructure as a function of multilingualism. And then we did a comparison between mono to bi to tri to quadrilinguals in terms of the subcortical volumes. And obviously, in this case, spoiler alert. Obviously, in this case, we use number of languages as a proxy of increasing, controlling, switching experiences, right? It's not a good measure, I agree, but you need to start with something. So we found those patterns. So what you see here is the volumes of the putamen, left and right hemisphere, for monolinguals, bilinguals, trilinguals, and quadrilinguals. And we find a non-linear effect. So the putamen gets bigger as you learn languages, but when you speak many languages, 4 in this case, it gets smaller again. Similar effects for the globus pallidus, and both structures are involved in articulatory control. Yeah, so you control which languages you produce each time. Similar patterns for the nucleus accumbens, involving motivational behavior. That's another favorite structure. Let's not go into details. But we didn't find any differences in the codec for mono versus bi versus trilinguals. And the idea is that these people are very experienced, so the codec has gone through all this phase of increase and decrease and has renormalized for these groups, at least. Still the beginning, right? And studying multilingualism is a real bugger. Very, very briefly, because I mentioned diglossia, and I think many of you will be interested in this, we finished a behavioral project very recently looking at diglossia in Saudi Arabia. So we have this interesting linguistic situation where you have the formal, the standard Arabic only used in the school, university, formal environments, and also the local variety used at home. So we treated this as a very good example of a single language context as it is described in the ACH. We started with a review paper, which I will invite you to find, which shows that there isn't a lot of evidence looking at these environments, and the evidence that we have on what they do cognition in the brain remains very mixed. What we did is tested older and younger diglossics in Saudi Arabia on a flanker task. Again, behavioral study, right? And we found that there are some cognitive benefits in older diglossics in a flanker task, but not the younger diglossics. And this sounds very familiar because this is what has been reported in standard bilingualism. And we think we find these effects of flanker task because flanker task taxes inhibition a lot. And inhibition is what you need to exercise where you're in a single language environment, right? There's no option of switching between languages. You have to speak the formal one or the non-formal one, okay? So that wasn't on the brain, but this, I'd like to think this is the beginning of such a research program. So that was the work by Najla Al-Roita, another former student of mine. Yes, I've been exploiting my PhD students. So bilingualism does affect brain structure, probably through excessive taxing of brain regions that undertake language acquisition, processing, and control. These effects are related to changes in brain function and behavior, but we don't know how everything links together yet, and we still need to do that. And these effects are linked to individual experiences, including sustained usage of more than one languages. I've mentioned that already. Active bilingualism is a complex, cognitively challenging skill, which is not a leisure activity, right? It's something you need to do. There's no escape if you're in an immersive environment. Last slide. Long-term active engagement with bilingualism contributes to better preserve the brain tissue in healthy aging population, causes a brain reserve, and may lead to more efficient spare tissue when you're faced with neurodegenerative disease, which is the cognitive reserve. This is just the beginning. We know very little about how all these different experiences affect the brain and result in different types of reserves and in different groups. So my answer to most of your questions will probably, I don't know yet, right? But that was it. Thank you very much. Our labs are nothing if it's not for our people. So I thought I'd start with, I'd put the serious pictures of my former students and collaborators, but then I thought, why? So I just want to thank the people that have been with me for the past 8 years that made this program, made it happen practically. My former students that you've seen throughout these studies, and also my collaborators like Jason Rothman, Jenny Treffers-Dallas, so on and so forth. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone actually. And thank you very much.